She walked into that courtroom alone.
No lawyers. No fancy suites.
Just a 62-year-old woman in gray slacks holding a thin folder. Her mother-in-law took one look and smiled. Not a nice smile. A predator's smile. The kind wealthy people give when they think they've already won. But then the judge said 4 words that changed everything. "Good morning, Colonel." And that smile? It vanished instantly. Most people never pay attention to quiet people. That's the secret nobody tells you. 3 months earlier, Margaret was doing something completely ordinary. She was making chicken soup in her Virginia kitchen when the letter arrived. Certified mail. Her hands started shaking before she even opened it. She already knew. After decades of burying the real version of herself, she knew exactly what was coming. Her husband Frank had died 6 months before. And now his family was about to tear everything apart. The lawsuit papers were brutal. Undue influence. Emotional manipulation. They were coming for the one thing that actually mattered: a simple lake house on Smith Mountain Lake. Not some mansion. Just an old cabin with creaky floors that Frank had spent 32 years loving. The place where he died. But here's where it gets darker. They weren't just fighting over property. They were trying to paint Margaret as some kind of gold digger who manipulated a dying man. As a greedy, emotional widow who isolated Frank from his family. Everything they said was a lie. And Margaret knew exactly how to prove it. But first, she had to pretend to lose. See, here's what people don't understand about women over 60 in America. You become invisible. Cashiers don't make eye contact. Doctors interrupt you mid-sentence. Young lawyers look right through you like your furniture. And Evelyn Carter? She looked at Margaret like she was looking at a ghost. A weak, helpless ghost who couldn't possibly fight back. That was Evelyn's first mistake. Margaret's daughter Anna begged her to settle. "Mom, Grandma Evelyn has money. She has lawyers. She has power. Just give her the house." Anna was exhausted. Divorce, 2 kids, a brutal job. She couldn't handle seeing her mother destroyed in court. But Margaret smiled quietly and said nothing, because there was something Anna didn't know about her mother. There was something Margaret had buried so deep that almost nobody knew the truth. Even her own daughter only knew pieces. Frank knew everything. He'd kept her secret for decades. And he was gone for 20 years. Margaret hadn't been a housewife. She'd been a colonel in the military's legal system. She'd prosecuted soldiers, defended the innocent ones, sat in courtrooms overseas watching people's entire lives get decided by evidence and strategy. Then she retired.
She wanted peace.
Gardens. Coffee on the porch. She wanted to be invisible. And she was. Until Evelyn Carter dragged her into war a week after the lawsuit papers arrived. Evelyn did something stupid. She invited the whole family to Sunday dinner. See, Evelyn never hosted unless she had an audience. She needed witnesses to her victory. The moment Margaret walked in, she felt it. The entire thing was a performance. Evelyn's expensive white columns. The polished silverware. Everything designed to intimidate. Richard barely looked at Margaret. Sandra gave her that tight, fake smile wealthy people use when they're pretending to be moral. And Evelyn? She started cutting her roast and casually mentioned how Margaret must be overwhelmed financially now. Then Richard leaned in. Dad always wanted the property to stay in the Carter bloodline. Margaret didn't flinch. Frank made his wishes very clear. Evelyn's eyes went cold. "That's what your lawyers claim," she said slowly. But here's the crazy part: Margaret didn't even have lawyers yet. And that's when Margaret realized something terrifying. They thought she'd panic. They thought she'd disappear quietly. They thought they'd already beaten her. Evelyn leaned back in her chair and smiled that predator smile again. "You know your problem, Margaret? You always acted like you were smarter than everyone else." The table went silent. "You were just a housewife at the end of the day." That one landed different. Not because of pride, but because Frank had known exactly who she was. He'd respected her. He'd believed in her. Margaret set down her fork carefully and looked Evelyn dead in the eye. "I'll see you in court." Evelyn laughed. "Oh, Margaret. You're finished." That night, sitting alone on her porch listening to thunder over the water, Margaret opened a leather case she hadn't touched in years. Her military records. Her commission papers. Her silver eagle insignia. She held it in her palm and smiled, not from anger, from something much more dangerous. Certainty. The morning of the hearing, Margaret woke before sunrise. That used to happen before every major tribunal overseas. The body remembering pressure before the mind could catch up. She sat in the dark with black coffee warming her hands while Norfolk was still asleep. She dressed simply. Gray slacks. Navy blouse. Nothing flashy. Nothing that invited attention. She tied her silver hair back and looked in the mirror.
Perfect.
A widow. A grandmother. Someone people would overlook in a grocery store. When she walked into the courthouse, Evelyn was already there.
Of course she was.
Cream-colored designer suit. Pearls the size of small rocks. And 3 expensive lawyers surrounding her like bodyguards. Evelyn spotted Margaret, and that smile returned. Well, look who actually came, but then Evelyn noticed something strange. Margaret was alone, and no lawyer.
No backup.
Just a thin folder and absolute calm. One of the attorneys looked confused. You don't have representation, Margaret just kept walking. Evelyn laughed. Oh, sweetheart, this isn't small claims court. But Margaret didn't respond. She just sat at the defense table and waited. The moment Judge Harold Bennett walked in, something shifted in the room. He was former Navy. Sharp eyes. Disciplined posture. And the second he saw Margaret, he stopped moving. Recognition. Then surprise. Then something that looked like respect. Evelyn's attorney launched into his opening statement. He was good. Really good. He painted Margaret as an emotionally unstable widow who'd manipulated a dying man. He used careful language. Emotionally loaded phrasing. He called her financially dependent. By the time he finished, the courtroom practically expected Margaret to cry. Instead, she just organized her papers quietly. Judge Bennett looked at her. Mrs. Hayes, will you be representing yourself? Yes, Your Honor. Evelyn smiled. Victory was so close she could taste it. But then the judge did something strange. He studied Margaret for another moment. And slowly, he stood a little straighter. Then came 4 words that changed everything. Good morning, Colonel. The entire courtroom froze. Evelyn's smile vanished. Richard blinked. One of the attorneys literally lowered his pen. And behind Margaret, her daughter whispered, "What?" The judge nodded slightly. It's been a long time. Margaret nodded back. Yes, sir. Evelyn stared like the floor had opened beneath her. Colonel, she repeated weakly. The older attorney's face went pale. He already understood what was happening. The woman he was about to destroy wasn't a grieving widow. She was a retired military prosecutor who'd spent 20 years dismantling people in courtrooms. That's when everything shifted, the attorney asked nervously. You have legal experience. Judge Bennett looked at him evenly. That would be an understatement. Judge Bennett looked at him evenly. That would be an understatement. For the first time all day, fear entered Evelyn Carter's eyes. See, here's what military law teaches you. The people most desperate to seem powerful always carry the biggest binders. The best prosecutors rarely raise their voices. They ask small questions. Careful questions. Questions that slowly remove all the places to hide. Margaret opened her folder and calmly asked one question. Did you personally interview my husband's oncology nurses? The attorney hesitated. And no, did you review hospice records? No, did you speak with his doctor? No, she sat back down. That was all. Simple.
Precise.
But suddenly, the entire courtroom understood something Evelyn never had. Margaret knew exactly how courtrooms worked. Then came the evidence. Margaret opened her thin folder and pulled out a notarized letter Frank had signed 8 months before he died. In it, he explicitly stated the lake house was hers. And then he wrote the sentence that destroyed everything. I am making this statement voluntarily, without coercion or influence. The attorney's face tightened. Evelyn looked stunned. That's impossible, she whispered. And oh, Margaret said quietly, it's inconvenient. The courtroom atmosphere shifted completely. Now people weren't looking at Evelyn as a grieving mother. They were looking at her as a wealthy woman challenging a dying man's final wishes. During recess, Richard approached carefully. Maybe we should discuss settlement options. Interesting. An hour earlier they wanted war. Now, they wanted discussion. But Margaret just said, your brother already made his decision. When court resumed, Judge Bennett asked Margaret if she had additional evidence. She did. Margaret pulled out email exchanges between Frank and Evelyn. And there it was, Evelyn pressuring Frank about the property during chemotherapy treatments, demanding updates, insisting he fix his estate. Then came the smoking gun, a recording. The bailiff played Evelyn's voice through the courtroom speakers.
Cold. Sharp.
Unmistakable. If Margaret really loved you, she'd put the lake house back in the Carter family before you die. Then Frank's exhausted voice. Mom, stop, just those 2 words. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a dying man begging for peace. The entire courtroom went silent. Evelyn sat frozen. For the first time all day, she didn't look powerful. She looked old. Judge Bennett removed his glasses slowly. Mrs. Carter, this court now has serious concerns regarding coercive interference in estate matters. Then came the final line that shattered everything. Criminal fraud exposure may become a consideration. BY Day 4. The Carter family empire was collapsing in public. The attorneys stopped fighting. They just wanted it to end. Evelyn stopped making eye contact with anyone. Richard kept loosening his tie like he couldn't breathe. When it was time for final statements, Judge Bennett looked at Margaret.
Colonele.
Do you have anything you'd like to say? Margaret stood slowly. The courtroom went completely silent. My husband spent the final year of his life in pain, she said softly. Cancer strips dignity away piece by piece. People who haven't witnessed it don't understand that, she paused. Frank lost weight, strength, sleep, independence, but he never lost clarity. Evelyn looked down. He knew exactly what he wanted.
Peace. Quiet. Time at the lake.
And freedom from pressure. The older attorney shifted uncomfortably. The lake house was never about money to me, Margaret continued. Frank rebuilt that dock himself. He taught our grandson to fish there. He spread his father's ashes near those trees. It was the last place my husband felt like himself. She swallowed carefully. Then she said the thing she'd carried silently for months. I did not spend 32 years loving a man just to steal from him after he became weak. Evelyn closed her eyes. And for the first time in her life, she looked truly ashamed. Judge Bennett reviewed the documents one final time. Then he spoke. This court finds overwhelming evidence supporting the deceased's estate intentions. The petition is denied in full. Anna burst into tears. Furthermore, Judge Bennett continued, the court finds credible evidence of coercive conduct toward the deceased during periods of medical vulnerability. Evelyn looked physically ill. The lake house remains solely under the ownership of Colonel Margaret Hayes. Just like that. It was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. But Margaret ignored them. Anna hugged her tightly. You won, Anna whispered. Margaret looked at her daughter and smiled softly. No. Your father 1.3 months after the ruling, something unexpected happened. Evelyn called. Margaret almost didn't answer. But then she realized something. Unfinished bitterness weighs more than conversation. So she agreed to meet. They sat across from each other in a diner while rain tapped against the windows. Evelyn looked different.
No designer suit. No pearls.
Just a gray coat. For the first time, she looked ordinary. And somehow that made her seem older. Finally, Evelyn spoke. I was angry at Frank for years, she said softly. He chose you over this family every time. Silence. When he got sick, I think I panicked. I thought if I controlled the estate, controlled the property, maybe I wouldn't lose him completely. Margaret understood then. This wasn't about greed. It was about fear. Fear disguised as control. I loved him, too, Margaret said quietly. Tears filled Evelyn's eyes. I know that now. That sentence carried more weight than any courtroom ruling. 3 months after the court ruling, Margaret stood on the dock at the lake house one October morning. Fog drifted across the water. The cold waves reflected moonlight. Frank loved mornings like that. Said the lake looked honest before sunrise.
No boats. No noise. No performances. Just stillness.
At 62, Margaret had started appreciating stillness more than victory. People treated her differently after the trial. Neighbors who barely waved before suddenly wanted conversations. Strangers recognized her at the grocery store.
Colonel Hayes, they'd say.
Funny how quickly titles change people's behavior, but honestly, Margaret had never wanted attention. After decades in military courtrooms watching people's lives get decided, recognition felt very small. The real change happened with her daughter. For years, Anna had only seen her mother as reliable,
Quiet.
predictable. Now Anna looked at her with curiosity, with pride, with understanding. One afternoon, Margaret's grandson Caleb found an old military photograph in a drawer. It showed Margaret at 38 in full dress uniform, sharp posture, and eyes that had already seen too much. "Grandma, is this really you?" he asked excitedly. "Yes, you look scary." Margaret laughed harder than she had in months. Later that Christmas Eve, as snow dusted the dock, Caleb sat beside her by the fireplace holding that old photograph. "Grandma, were you really important?" Children ask dangerous questions because they expect honest answers. Margaret thought carefully, then smiled softly. "I was useful." He considered that seriously, then nodded like it made perfect sense. Maybe it did, because here's what nobody tells you about getting older. Being important feels hollow after a while. But being useful? Being the person who stands quiet but steady when everything falls apart? That means something. That night, after everyone went to bed, Margaret stepped outside alone. The lake reflected moonlight in long silver streaks. Cold air filled her lungs. And for the first time since Frank died, the silence didn't hurt. It comforted. She realized then that the entire courtroom battle had never been about revenge. It was about protecting love from being rewritten by bitterness. It was about refusing to let a dead man's final wishes get destroyed by greed. And maybe that's something worth remembering. People will underestimate you. They'll see gray hair and assume weakness. They'll watch you fade into invisibility and think you're helpless. But quiet people carry power they never announce. Dignity has a strange way of revealing itself when it matters most. And if you ever feel invisible, remember this widow. Remember how she sat calmly in a courtroom with nothing but the truth and a thin folder. Remember how she didn't raise her voice or cry or beg. She just knew who she was, and sometimes that's all the power you ever need.